on this computer. There we go. And okay. Okay, hopefully, there we go. Okay. Okay. Chapter 6. What do we do in chapter 6? Now that we moved from one good to all the goods, one group of consumers to all the consumers, one group of producers to all the producers, now we're ready to discuss major macroeconomics policies. Macro policies, okay? Macro policies. When we are in macroeconomics area, large, something large, what do we concern ourselves with, okay? Or better yet, what do policymakers, when they design and implement a policy, are concerned with, okay? Annoying pop-ups, okay? So macro policies, and chapter 6 introduces those major macro policies. So first things first, okay? As I said before, the major indicator, the major description of an economy, it's GDP value, gross domestic product. How much of it we are producing? Are we producing enough? And how much is enough, right? It's the good parallel to look at it is when I grade your first exam and I upload the grades, I would always have someone asking me, hey, what was the average grade for the first test? Why would you want to know that? There is no such thing as an average student, right? Why would someone want to know the average grade for test 1? Anybody?
Well, I think with a lot of students, they want to know because they want to see how they perform to the rest of the class.
Yes, very good. Excellent. Excellent help. You want to know how your individual test looks with respect to the rest of the class. So you need a benchmark, right? Some kind of an indicator that represents the entire class so you can compare your individual grade to that indicator. You need a benchmark, right? So the same for the economy. Like I just said, oh, we're producing so much more of GDP. Well, how much more is enough? And when is it enough? So when we consider ourselves with growth, and economy growth is represented by a growth in GDP, how do we know when we need to stop or we need to increase our growth? We need a benchmark, right? A benchmark for the entire economy. And that benchmark is called potential GDP. Okay, potential GDP, okay? I'm gonna give you a verbal explanation and we're gonna write it down. Potential GDP refers to the how much of output we could produce if we use all our resources at full. Output we could produce if we use all our resources at full, right? All our resources at full. Okay, let's talk about it. I really like you to have a very good grasp and understanding what potential GDP is. Okay, let's have a simple example. Every one of you has the potential of getting an A in this class. Am I right or am I right? Of course I'm right, right? Every one of you has a potential. You do. You're in this university, you were admitted. By being admitted, okay, you're giving a green light saying, we know that you can, right? But will everyone get an A in this class? Probably not. I wish you would make me so happy. But the actual grade will depend on how much time and effort and thinking and brain power, how much resources you're willing to put in this class. If you put it all you have, seriously, you'll get an A, right? That's how it works. So potential GDP means full usage of resources. Now, resources are kind of very shady area, right? Water is a resource, air is the resource, electricity is the resource, gas, oil, coal, all of it. Yeah, it's all, how we know if we use all of them? Well, there is one resource that is very easy to count, right? And it's a labor force. Labor force. We know exactly how many workers we have at any given point in time. We know the size of our labor force. Of course we do. We know exactly how many workers we have in the labor force. So if we are producing at full employment, if we are producing at full employment, then every worker will hold one job and we will be producing at potential GDP. Okay? We will be producing at potential GDP. So here is a relatively easy trick to learn, okay, and to keep with you when we talk about potential GDP. If we are producing at full employment, where every worker in our labor force holds one job, then we are producing at potential GDP, okay? Full employment means potential GDP, and potential GDP means full employment. If somebody tells you, oh, the economy is currently producing at potential GDP, that should instantly tell you that we are producing at full employment, okay? And full employment means 100% use of labor force, of our labor force. And again, let's be very explicit. Every worker holds a job. That's what full employment means. Every worker holds a job. Okay. Okay. Any questions so far?
Would that include part-time workers?
Yes, everyone who is on the roster to receive a paycheck, yes. Everyone's holding a job, yes. Okay. Okay, so full employment, potential GDP, full employment, they always walk hand in hand, always come together, okay? What I would like you to think is this. Every time I mention potential GDP, you think full employment. Every time I mention full employment, you think potential GDP. Okay, that's how it should work. So potential GDP, a benchmark, depends on our usage of resources. Okay. What can you tell me? And you don't really need to go anywhere in deep to answer this question. Are we currently operating at full employment?
No, we are not.
How do you know that?
Well, with the unemployment rate, we're not all employed.
Excellent. Excellent. That rate is everywhere on news. And you don't even have to read the newspaper and retain this information to know that if the unemployment rate is a non-zero number, a non-zero positive number, right? We're not operating at full employment. A positive non-zero number for the unemployment rate a positive number for the unemployment rate means there are people on the street that would like to have a job and they don't, right? A positive non-zero number for the unemployment rate means we are not operating at, oh goodness, full employment. And what does it tell you about potential GDP? Are we producing at potential GDP right now?
No.
No, because we're not operating at full employment. You see the chain of events. Once you figure out what happens with the employment, you can easily tell what happens with GDP, okay? So for our own sake and for the sake of the country, there is a potential GDP and there is an actual GDP. And the actual GDP depends on the actual usage of resources, okay? Depends on the actual usage of resources. Okay, in this case, we're looking at the usage of the labor force. Okay? With a positive unemployment rate, with a positive number for the unemployment rate, we know that the actual employment is below full employment. If we have people who want to hold a job and don't, then we don't have full employment. Okay. For conditions, okay, let me take this away, resources there. Okay. For conditions when actual employment is below full employment, we can say that actually produced GDP will be below potential GDP. So if this is potential GDP, then actual GDP is moving away or not reaching that potential level. Okay, all right. So here's what we have. The potential GDP is our benchmark. Actual GDP is what we are actually producing. Okay, how do we know how much of actual GDP we're producing? Well, we calculate it by the usage of the labor force. We take hours of work times output per hour. And this output per hour is also called labor productivity. So this is how we calculate the actual GDP, how much in actuality we are producing. Hours at workplaces times the output per hour. There we are, okay? Okay. Now, potential GDP. Potential GDP depends and usually calculated based on the following factors. First one, it depends on the growth rate of labor force. Growth rate of labor force. Okay, what does it mean? That means every year, secondary school institutions or trade schools or community colleges are graduating more and more and more graduates. And every one of those graduates are entering the labor force. And because we're graduating more and more, the labor force grows over time. Okay, right? Second, the growth rate of nations' capital stock. Growth rate of nations' capital stock. Okay. So second factor refers to the growth, and nation's capital stock is a fancy name for simply saying equipment, machinery, okay, physical capital. What those labor force workers have to work with. Okay, so look what happens. If the labor force is growing, so is the equipment. Okay, we can't say, or rather we don't say, well, we have plenty of workers, but we have nothing to employ them with because we don't have the capital. We do. So our nation's capital stock is growing along with the growth of the labor force. And third factor is the rate of technological progress. Technological progress. Okay. Okay, rate of the technological. Okay. Technological progress. What do we know about the technological progress? Well, for once, we're operating at a technological frontier. What does it mean? You think of an invention, we have it, okay? Is there something else you would like to have? We have it. Operating at a technological frontier, okay, has its advantages and disadvantages. The major disadvantage, it takes a lot of time, money, investments, human power to come up with something new, okay? So we are coming up with something new, but a bit slowly because like I said, we have it all, right? But still, think back to a PPF, okay? In terms of technology, we are operating on a PPF, but we're not staying there passively. We are keep pushing that frontier, keep pushing that technological envelope further away, outside, making equipment more efficient, making production more efficient. Look at iPhones, look at the computer technology, look at all the gadgets we have, and they keep coming, the updates are keep coming. What does it mean? That means we're keep moving forward in terms of technological progress, right? So saying all of it, look, the labor force is continuously growing. The nation capital stock equipment is continuously growing, and we keep inventing. All the three factors keep moving us forward. So that means through time, the potential of the economy is growing, increasing at about 1 to 2%, depending. Increasing at about 1 to 2% a year. Okay, so we keep pushing that potential higher and higher and higher. Okay. If we are to graphically represent the potential, what happens to the potential GDP of this economy through time? Because we keep pushing that frontier outward, the potential of the economy grows at about the same rate, about 1.8, 1.5, okay? So to show that on the graph, we simply need to show a positively, yes. I cannot hear you. You're breaking down. I cannot hear what the question is. No? Okay. So if we are to draw a graphical representation of potential GDP through time, what we're going to end up with a relatively straight line with a positive slope. Okay, labor force is growing, capital is growing, technology is improving. So we keep pushing that frontier outward. So the GDP with every new year that comes in, potential increases. Okay, right? So that's potential. Okay, what about actual? Well, you told me yourself that currently we are not producing at potential GDP. You said that the current unemployment rate is greater than 0. So we're not at full employment, right? That means the actual GDP we're currently producing at is below potential, okay? But there were times when the actual GDP was above potential. So look, if we are to use this graph and represent the actual GDP, this is how it's going to look. Okay, right? So a straight line with a positive slope that runs through time represents potential GDP. The wavy green line that fluctuates or waves around the potential trend is actual GDP. Okay. When we look at the two over a long time period, look what I got, 1870 to 2020. It is 150 years, right? When we look at the two, potential and actual, over a long time period, we will find that the green line diving under the potential GDP and then jumping over and diving again, these fluctuations over a long time are simply going to cancel each other. Okay, dive down is canceled by the jump up, dive down by the jump up. So on average, over a long time, 80, 100, 150, we'll find that actual GDP is at its potential level over a long time period, 80, 100, 120, 150 years. When the short-term fluctuations are canceling each other, we end up on potential GDP, okay? Right? The big deal is here. 150 years from now, we're all gonna be dead, right? Okay. What matters to us is today and tomorrow, probably next year too. So for us, for our happiness, we're really concerned with the shorter time periods, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That's probably as far as we can go. These time periods are much shorter and called short run periods. Okay, so let's look at short run sum. Okay, let's take this one. Okay, for this short time period, about 4 years. Okay, about 4 years. What do we have? We have the green line that represents actual GDP, dives down and is located below potential GDP. GDP actual, I'm going to use the 3 letters ACT as an abbreviation for actual. Okay, for just that time period, okay, actual GDP is below potential. What does it tell us about the usage of the labor force? Okay, actual employment versus full employment, right? If actual GDP is below potential, that means only one thing, is actual employment is below full employment. What does it mean? That means we have problems with high unemployment. For the time periods when the actual GDP is below potential and actual employment is below full employment, we call those time periods recessions or depressions. Okay, and the problem with those time periods, high unemployment rate. High unemployment rate, okay, right? Any questions about this short time period? No? Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up some room here. And we're going to look at a slightly different time period. Okay. Okay. Let's look at this one. At this time period. Okay. Looking at the potential GDP or potential trend, sometimes it's also called, and a wavy green line, what do we see? The green line jumps over potential. Okay. If green line represents potential GDP, then for this purple time period, we'll have actual GDP higher than potential. Okay. The very next step, once we determine the connection between actual and potential GDP, we need to know what happens to the employment, okay, or unemployment. If actual GDP exceeds potential, that means actual employment exceeds full employment. Okay. Actual employment exceeds full employment. How is it possible? Let's think about it a little bit. Help me out here. Actual employment exceeds full employment. What do you think?
Would that be like a period of time when a new product is made where like a bunch of jobs open up, or a bunch of companies open up a ton of jobs?
And
So like, I'm trying to think of a good example.
yeah. That's
So
a
like,
great, that's a great way to keep thinking. So what I'm saying is this. Look, a simple example. Let's say we have 100 workers in a labor force, but when you look at the payroll, you find there is 120 names. That's what actual employment means. Actual employment is greater than full employment. How is it possible? You can do it. How we can have more people on payroll versus the number of the workers in the labor force?
You could have people on like work visas.
I'm not talking about immigrants. I'm talking about, let's say, US labor force, 100 workers. But when I look at the payroll, there's 120 names.
I mean, would that have something to do with like overestimating your labor?
No. Back to the time when you were saying that the company is doing so well, it's offering so many new job openings.
So like if a company starts doing well and then all of a sudden they start doing bad again, they have too many people to be able to supply for what they need.
How come we can have a condition when the actual employment exceeds full employment? When we compare the two, we really just address the issue with our labor force. No incoming and outgoing, documented or not documented immigrants. No, we're actually dealing with US labor force. How is it possible? How is it possible when the actual employment exceeds full employment? You know the answer. How can I possibly work more than 8 hours a day? Can I? Physical possibility. Can I work, I don't know, 20 hours a day?
I mean, you can if you're getting paid overtime.
Okay, so some of the entries could be for overtime, or some of the entries could be for workers holding more than one job, right? Some of the workers holding more than one job. So their names are showing up on the payroll more than once, okay? Some people holding more than one job, okay? All right, like you said, there are so many openings. Why not? If I physically can hold two jobs, why not? Okay. So what do you think happens with production if we're more working not beyond our physical ability, but working more than usual? The production explodes, right? That's exactly what happens to that green line when it jumps over the potential. Overemployment creates overproduction. Okay. So where does it leave us? Now, first of all, if people are picking up a second or maybe a third job, clearly we do not have a problem with unemployment. Am I right or am I right? No unemployment problems. Okay, I'm going to slide down. Okay, that means no unemployment problems. Okay. Then what kind of problems we have? Well, think about this way. You're working so much more. Again, remember the reason we're working, so we can live comfortable lives, so we can spend. You probably have a really great spending plans. You work more, you spend more. Okay. That talks about our change of preferences from spending a little to spending a lot. That means shifting our demand curves for every single good to the right. If you can have the demand and supply for a good in your mind, that shift creates a higher equilibrium price. So working more, spending more, we're pushing up the prices for everything. Okay, that's true for the time periods when the green line jumps over potential. We do not have unemployment problems. The problem that we have is inflation. Okay, overproduction leads to over spending, and that leads to price increase. Okay. So for the time periods when the actual GDP exceeds potential, when we're overemployed, we're overproducing, overspending, the problem is high inflation or problem with inflation, period. Okay. 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 Any questions?
I do. Can you
Yeah.
hear me better?
What was it again?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just really quick. I missed like 6 minutes of this lecture because I had to switch headsets because my other one wasn't working. After the lecture, can you go, excuse me, I'm sorry. Can we go through the graph one more time up above this? Because I missed that whole part.
Sure. Yeah. So the straight line, the straight line that runs uphill represents potential GDP. Okay. The wavy green line represents actual GDP. Potential is the reason it's a straight line because the potential of an economy increases every year. The reason that green line is a wavy line, it's actual output and it depends on the actual employment. And here we have, let's see, here we have the red period. When the green line dives under the potential GDP, that's the economy underproducing. And we're looking at actual unemployment being below the full employment. For the purple time period, we see the green line jumping over potential. The economy is overproducing. The actual GDP exceeds potential. That means actual employment exceeds full employment. And the problem during that time period is inflation. Okay, so what we have in this graph is actually the entire history of the US GDP, maybe slightly exaggerated to a slightly higher scale between 1870 to 20. And what do we see? That's all happens through the history of GDP. The actual GDP is either diving under the potential or jumps over the potential. Okay, so we either have a recession, oh yeah, the purple period is called expansion. I'm glad we came back to the graph. Okay, right, so diving under is a recession, jumping over expansion. Under a recession, jumping over expansion. So that's all we have. And every one of these dives is called a business cycle. Okay, just like on the previous professionally built graph, we have a slightly better graph that's easy to understand. Okay, so when we talk about stabilization policies, okay, from the previous chapter, when we are in this period, red period, when the actual GDP dives below potential, we expect the government and the central bank to step in and get us out of the recession because it hurts. The unemployment rate is too high. When we're entering an expansion, we expect the government or the central bank do something not to take us away from the expansion because the times are too good, but to handle the inflation in such a way that's not going to hurt us. Okay, and that's what happens to GDP. It's either dives under potential or jumps over, dives under or jumps over. There is nothing else. Okay, the important part is to determine where we are currently now, and that's where the actual conditions with unemployment rate is helping us. Okay, so back to
Thank
the
you.
title of chapter 6, macro policies. The major policy that has ever been developed or will be developed and implemented first is to see where we are actual GDP wise versus potential. Okay, are we in the red recession period or we're in the purple expansion period? Okay, that will always be question number one for policymakers. Compare actual GDP and potential. Okay, all right. So when we look at GDP numbers, okay, sometimes by just looking at GDP doesn't really tell us much, even when we are comparing the actual GDP of a country to its potential level. But let's see, for example, if we compare GDP from China from the period from the previous year versus GDP from Switzerland from the previous year, right? 2020, GDP, okay? The number itself, which country's GDP will surely be larger without actually knowing the numbers? Which one do you think?
China.
China's, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Does it mean that a regular Chinese lives better, wealthier than a regular Swiss? You can answer the question without any
No.
additional information. No, it's not. No, it's not. As a matter of fact, rural parts of China are so poor, so incredibly poor. Okay. So what we're missing here? We're missing the size of the population. Okay. So look what happens. If we take these GDPs and divide by the population side from this country, what will happen to that inequality sign? It will be completely opposite, okay? We usually look at GDP as the nation's wealth created by the population, okay? So take China's wealth created in the previous year and divided by the population versus wealth created by Switzerland and divided by its population. What are we going to end up with? Every one of these numbers will be called GDP per capita. Meaning, we broke down GDPs per every individual living in these countries, and we found that a regular Swiss is better off, wealthier than a regular Chinese. Okay, that's what GDP per capita is telling us. It's enough to compare actual GDP potential to see how the economy is evolving over time. But when we talk about wealth of individuals, we look at GDP per capita. Okay. Okay, so a little bit, so we did say I erased it. Okay, back to that question, back to that picture. In the long run, Okay, we said 80, 100, 120, 150 years. We would have actual GDP matching potential. Okay. But when we talk about the short run, was right now, we will never have these two numbers the same. Okay, right? What we have in the short run is a red period when the actual GDP is diving below potential, or a purple period when the green line jumps over the potential. Okay, right? And the short run is what is very dear to us because that's when we live. So of course we expect the policymakers to step up and help us out, give us a hand, okay? Get us out of this recession. I think the last one, 2009 through 2016, it's a pretty long recession. That's why it was called the Great Recession, okay? Right, so what happens during the times when the actual GDP dives under the potential, okay? The economy is shrinking in, is getting smaller. It fails to generate enough of workplaces to employ everyone who wants to work, right? Now, for the opposite, for the purple time period, when the green line jumps over potential, the economy is doing well. Every project, just like you said, every project succeeds. There are plenty of job openings. Okay, you see how different these two business cycles: shrinking, sick economy, booming, expanding economy. Okay, all right. So being concerned with GDP, comparing actual GDP with potential GDP is a task number one on policymakers' lists. Number one, macro policy. What is happening to actual GDP? And the answer to the question comes from comparison of actual GDP and potential. Okay. Now, GDP is produced by households, by consumers, by you and me. So once GDP question has been handled, question number two on policymakers' to-do list is what happens with employment? Right? Just now we said comparing actual and potential GDP will give us a clearer picture what actual employment is like. Okay. Second major task as a macro policy. Okay, GDP first, employment second. Okay. So talking about employment, and we can talk about employment nonstop forever. Luckily for you and for me probably too, we don't have forever. Okay, maybe 5-7 more minutes of the lecture today. Okay, so employment. When we talk about employment and our labor force, we have two major groups of people: people who are employed and the unemployed. So first, let's make sure we understand both. So they employed. Okay, so they employed are those who are holding a job. End of story. Anyone holding a job, okay, on the official payroll, okay, not working for cash, on official payroll when you're getting a paycheck and you pay your taxes and so on and so forth. Okay. The unemployed, this group is slightly harder to define, okay? It's not enough to just say anyone without a job. That's not enough to say that, because we have people who never had a job and never would want to. Those are not the unemployed, right? So the trick here is to say the unemployed are those who are not currently holding a job, but is actively looking for one. Anyone without a job, now this but is very important, but actively looking for one, okay? The second part is that what makes one still part of the labor force, and this part, what makes someone who just lost a job qualify for the unemployment benefits, okay? You must be part of the labor force to qualify for unemployment benefits. How do you prove that? You fill out the form, Social Security office, you prove it to them, and different states have different ways to prove. You need to prove it to them that you're actively looking for a job. Okay, that second part shows that you are part of labor force. And if you are, you must be supported if you're not holding a job, okay? That's the important part. If you just lost your job, but you are not looking for a new one, you just exited the labor force and nobody cares, well, because Social Security offices don't care what happens to you, okay? You don't qualify for the unemployment benefits. Okay, all right. So the employed, anyone is holding a job. The unemployed, anyone without a job but actively looking for one. Okay, and now, how do we define or how do we calculate the unemployment rate? Okay, all right. And the unemployment rate is the number of the unemployed, over the civilian labor force. Okay. Okay. There was a great debate about how do we calculate the unemployment rate back in, I believe it was 2016 and 2017. Okay. What happens through time? The more recessions we get, the longer it takes us get out of one. The longer it takes the labor force to adjust to better conditions. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. So most of the time we would have a jobless recovery. What does it mean? The definition of a recession: 3 continuous quarters when GDP is dropping. Therefore, the definition of expansion: 3 continuous quarters when GDP is increasing. So what we saw during the end of 2015 and into 2016 is GDP picked up and went up. So we said, okay, we're out of the Great Recession. But when we looked at the unemployment rate, it was still about 8%, right? You would expect if the economy is expanding, the unemployment is going to drop. It didn't. It didn't come down to 3.5% until 2019. Okay, right? So that's why economists had a great debate. What happened? Why? We clearly see the economy is expanding because GDP is increasing continuously every quarter. We see that there are job openings. but we still have an unreasonably high unemployment rate, okay? What happened is, given how lengthy the recession was, some people were so disillusioned that they quit and stopped looking for a job. Once you do that, you're no longer part of the labor force. So even though, look what happens, this number was dropping, this number was also dropping. Okay, the numerator, the denominator was dropping faster. Okay, so that's what increased, gave us a little bit of a boost. We saw no change in the unemployment rate, and it was extremely confusing. Okay, all right. So the civilian labor force is a little bit a questionable issue. We're going to talk about the two. What I want to talk about, and that's probably would be our last topic for today, is to look at different types of unemployment. Types of unemployment. Okay. First one is frictional unemployment. Okay. Frictional unemployment refers to time between jobs. Times between jobs. Okay. So here, let's say you've been working quite hard for one of the companies and you expected a raise, you didn't get one, and you said, okay, fine. I know I qualify for more money. I know my skills are up to date. So you said, I'm just going to quit this job. I accumulated enough of savings to give myself a couple of months of vacation, or not a vacation, but I don't have to go to work. I will be looking for a new job. Okay, you quit your previous job, you didn't lose it, you quit it, you're giving yourself the time to a little bit of rest and start looking for a new job. Frictional unemployment. Or while working at the previous job, you found a better one. Okay, so let's say, what is it, Tuesday 23rd, you are quitting your current job on February 28th, and you're starting a new one on April 1st. Right? You're giving yourself a month, the whole month of March, a vacation. You will be between jobs. You will be returning to the new one on April 1st. You'll be frictionally unemployed. Okay? Second type of unemployment is structural. Structural unemployment. Okay. This is probably the only downside of a technological progress. What happens when we have a breakthrough in technology? We have more sophisticated equipment, right? And unless you know how to operate more sophisticated equipment, you can't use it, okay? Think back in time, you probably were toddlers then, when all the secretaries in all the offices, legal or otherwise, had to switch from electrical typewriter to a computer, right? What if you are so much advanced in the years that you just can't even think of learning new technology, especially as complicated as a computer? You can still do electrical typewriter, but no, I cannot possibly operate a computer. If this is the case, if my skills don't match the new level of technology, I'm going to lose my job, okay? The office is going to hire someone who can operate the computers. They don't want me anymore with my electrical typewriter, right? Next one is seasonal unemployment. And this is due different seasons of the year. It is easy to see here in Midwest and North, harder to see in the South, but we have jobs that are extremely season oriented. Now, if you're here in Macomb, you know this Dairy Queen place on West Jackson and Ward, right? It's closed. It's not in operation during winter times. So whoever is operating that kiosk, okay, through spring, summer, early fall, is seasonally unemployed during winter. Or another, that's when I was teaching it in face-to-face, I was giving so many in-class examples. Roofing firms, right? Don't see much roofing done during winter, right? Right? So what else we have? Golf course employment or pool employment, okay? Or switching back from winter to summer. How come we don't see any snow plows on the street when it's June? Heck, because there is no snow, right? Right? So seasonal unemployment. And the last one is cyclical unemployment. Due to business cycles. Okay, due to business cycles. And mostly, of course, a recession. Remember we said the reason for high unemployment during a recession is economy, economy is shrinking in and it fails to generate enough of workplaces. So people losing their jobs, not because they don't want to work or looking for a better one, not because their skills are not up to date, not because their jobs are seasonal. They're losing their jobs because there are not enough jobs generated by the economy. Okay, right? So here's the 4 types of unemployment: frictional, structural, seasonal, and cyclical. We're going to come back to that on Thursday. I'm going to stop right now. Okay. Do you have any questions, anybody?
Yes, I just had one question for a word.
Yeah.
It was by GDP. You had it underlined. Just a little bit more. Right there, where you have it underlined next to the purple GDP, and then it goes to China. What is that word right there? It's underlined. It says GDP, and then it has the arrow to GDP China 2020.
You mean this number?
Yes.
That's called numbers, GDP numbers.
Okay. Just wondering. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Sure. Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay. All right. I'm going to stop the recording and I will upload it later on today. Okay, I need to stop share and then stop the recording.